All right, so my name is Dakota Springston, and I am a history secondary education major. So I'm kind of used to people trying to remember what my name is, and I get confused with Springsteen a lot. And sometimes I don't mind because he actually is my sixth cousin, Bruce. But as much fun as it would be to come talk to you guys today about Bruce Springsteen and some of that fun, my topic today is a little bit before that. So I always like to start every one of my classes with a quick warm-up. So I'd like you guys to turn to your neighbors and see if you can figure out, we're coming up on a 100th anniversary of something, since this is 1916. And I always like to do a quick little this day in history. I want you guys to see if we can figure what this day in history is for this year. It was kind of apropos that we just had Gordon talking about Woodrow Wilson. We're going to get a little bit more about him today. Has anyone heard of the Punitive Expedition of 1916 before? It's a pretty new concept for most people. I'd actually had never heard of it until I was reading a book on Woodrow Wilson in World War I. And I saw a reference to the Punitive Expedition of General Pershing had been along, General Patton had been along, and I started saying, wow, this must have been a really interesting thing. What was the Punitive Expedition? I've always had an interest in sort of small wars or early American history or the history of American deployment overseas. So I got the opportunity to begin to develop this during HI 250 with Professor Fondez. And so I got interested in the Punitive Expedition, and I saw the most interesting part for me was the idea of mechanization. How many people either drove or rode the shuttle over here this morning on their way? All right, so all of us in some way were influenced by General Pershing during his Punitive Expedition, or as I like to call it, the Punitive Proving Ground. We have that nice little alliteration. So what is the Punitive Expedition? It's probably the first question on our mind. And what do these images have to do? We have a Humvee in Kandahar Province, Afghanistan. We have the Army GP in testing at Fort Myer, just down the road. And we have a deuce-and-a-half vehicle crushing a type of car. That's actually from the 1984 film Rambo. But I figured it showed a very good vision of sort of military mechanization. And I always find that my sixth graders love film references. So it seems to always pick up. And we have down here, it looks like a pretty old truck. This was one of our first military vehicles. So where did it begin? Well, America was attacked about 100 years ago. It was actually March 25th that the attack sort of happened in Columbus, New Mexico. Has anyone heard of Columbus, New Mexico? Small town. In 1916, it was a small town of about maybe 400. So in Arlington in 1916 was just a little bigger. Both were pretty rural. Columbus was an area that had been an Army staging depot. There was an Army base there, Army sort of barracks, as well as the outpost for the 7th and the 9th Cavalry. And yes, that is the same 7th Cavalry from General Custer's fame. They still had survived, and they'd sort of regrouped. And there were also a few townsmen there. There was a hotel, about 20 houses. It was a small town. It was a relatively wealthy town. Several members of the town had brand new 1916 Dodge automobiles, which was really the hot thing to have in 1916. And early in the morning of March 26th, a band of raiders led by the dashing General Francisco Pancho Villa crossed the border, and they attacked the small town. Well, the reason for the attack is not really known, and it really goes beyond the scope of this paper. Some suspect that it was an arms deal gone awry. There's also some who suspect that it was motivated by the Germans, especially to do with the Zimmermann telegram, as well as some of the influences of some of the weapons they found. Some of the weapons were German-made Mausers, which had been made in the previous year, which would have been very difficult for Pancho Villa to get within a year, especially since he was on the run the entire time. Well, the response is 17 Americans were killed in the attack. 2 of them were women. There were 4 kids killed. One of them was killed right in front of her parents. She was a 6-year-old girl. Another woman had her husband macheted to death in front of their house. One of the small hotels was burned to the ground. However, the casualties on the Mexican side were a bit heavier. Estimates vary. One of the authors who I sort of worked with very closely for this, a local military historian, Kim Ho-Lean, he estimates maybe that Vila had 500 with him, maybe 40 Vilistas, or the common term for Vila's soldiers, were killed. And it's called a guerrilla attack. The United States had supported Vila less than 2 years earlier, and he'd sort of lost his support in the Mexican Revolution. And so the United States is, of course, very mad. As we can see from this cartoon of the era, we have Uncle Sam jumping the border fence to go chase Vila, who's depicted here in sort of a character running off into Mexico. And he has in his hand sort of a smoking grenade. Vila had used several hand grenades, many of which were probably German in origin, which would be a very interesting sort of thing to look at. And Uncle Sam is saying, I know it's very hard to read, especially in the back. Uncle Sam is saying, I've had about enough of this. The United States had been engaged in several border wars along the Mexican border. They'd sort of gone from about 1840, when the United States first started stretching out that way. There were small disputes. There was, of course, the Mexican-American War. The Texas Rangers were really the only official border defense force along there. The United States Border Patrol wouldn't be founded until 1926, partially as a response to this attack. Most of the states were left up to their own defense. Sheriffs, the military had a lot to do, especially before the Theodore Roosevelt administration, when they started to have sort of a buildup of force. Well, the immediate response is the U.S. chases Vila. The first soldiers that chase him are on horseback, as it is the 7th Cavalry. They get pretty far, but after chasing him into Mexico, they get into sort of Vila's home turf. And Vila sort of has the upper hand. They got within about a mile of him before they lost him, and before they got the message from a pony rider who came up behind them, get out of Mexico before you start a war, because the United States is very worried about a sort of full-flung war with Mexico. Well, Woodrow Wilson and his advisors come together with the idea of the Punitive Expedition, which is sort of exactly like it sounds. It's a very sort of clever title as a way to go into Mexico and punish Vila. The United States has already been into Mexico in 1913 with the sort of invasion of Veracruz. So this was nothing really new for the United States. It was used to this at this point. There's also a theory, which I would really like to expound more, maybe in future work, that one of the key reasons that Wilson, as well as Pershing and Frederick Funston, who's also one of the other leaders of the expedition, who he's not as photogenic as the others, but he does have a really good name of Funston, had agreed for the expedition because it would be an excellent way to prepare the United States for the war that they all knew was coming. And what war would that be? World War I, of course, because World War I is raging in Europe, and at this time Wilson's sort of trying to find a way in. What we have up here is sort of the damage caused by Vila in Columbus. Now, if you go to Columbus today, nothing has really changed. The town's about the same. You can see where Vila sort of burned out. Some of the buildings are still burned areas there. It's very close to the Mexican border. There's a very cool little history museum where they have some of the original things there. But the mission is to apprehend Vila. And we have down here old Black Jack Pershing himself. And he'd actually come sort of straight from Arlington. He lived here in Arlington, just down the road. He lived at Fort Myer. And he'd also actually lived a little closer to Marymount at one point, off of 26th Street. And he also had visited the Birches, who lived in Birchwood, just down the way, one of the same men who Theodore Roosevelt had visited often. Now, how would the mission sort of go? Well, there were a lot of challenges in Mexico. Northern Mexico is not exactly the most hospitable area. Most of the soldiers who they sent were also farm boys. Probably in the 9 or so cavalry and infantry units that they sent, the majority of them came from Iowa, from Virginia, from northern Minnesota. They're sort of not exactly used to the desert. Well, Minnesota and Iowa are very flat, but they're not very arid. Mexico also doesn't have that much water. And what does a horse need to continue to move on? It needs water. There's also not much grazing land, scrub land like this. Sort of if you've ever seen many of John Ford's westerns, a lot of the areas where they'd end up chasing Vila are some of the areas that Ford himself used for filming a little later. And Vila himself was really no stranger. He'd been on film. D.W. Griffith had made a film just before the Punitive Expedition, before Vila attacked the United States, of Pancho Villa, sort of casting him as this swashbuckling hero who rode in on a stallion. And for most of it, Vila actually was sort of a swashbuckling hero. Northern Mexico had a few other challenges. Most of the locals loved Villa, and they supported him. It wasn't necessarily a safe place for the United States, especially for long, strung-out infantry columns who would be marching, or cavalry columns. A horse was very easy to sort of pick off with a rifle, especially if you're up here sort of in this or in the brush. It's very good land for ambushes. As well as some of the other land that they'd have to go through were some of the passes of the Sierra Madre. And normally when you think of Mexico, we're thinking of typical desert. Well, you think, oh, there's really no cold in Mexico. That's what some of the top army brass thought too. And so the uniform I'm wearing is your typical pattern 1912. And I wore this for two reasons. One, to give you guys a nice visual, and another so you didn't just have to look at boring old me. It gives you something else to look at during the presentation. Well, it's rather heavy wool, and it would be quite warm to wear on a warm day in Mexico. However, there was also another component of this jacket, sort of the 1912 overcoat. At one point, early on in the expedition, top army brass said, no overcoats because you're going into a semi-tropical country, and it's always warm there. Well, they found the passes in the Sierra Madre were quite snow-capped, and that was one of the challenges. Another, where is the enemy? You may never know exactly where the enemy is. They could be here or they could be there. That's sort of always one of those things you run into, especially in small wars. Are they here? Are they maybe that guy? Is this guy who we're talking to one of the enemy, or is he a friend? It's also the issue of transporting your food. Saying an army travels on its stomach is especially true in this era. One of the sources I consulted for working on this was the U.S. Army Baker's Manual of 1916. What do you guys think maybe the ration for a soldier per day of bread was? Any guesses? Okay, 2 pieces. Well, for this area, it was 5 pounds of bread per day, which that's a lot of bread. It's also because the soldiers wouldn't necessarily be getting meat, or if they were, it would be dried and not very much sustenance. So bread was really the backbone of the U.S. Army. And one of my favorite little comments in that book was, oh, if the bread spoils and there's bugs, brush the bugs out before you serve it to the soldiers. A lot of times things went wrong. So how do we come up with an answer or a solution to all of these challenges? Well, first they tried horses. Back in 1845, during the Mexican War, and shortly after, there was an idea by a young captain who would later go on to be Secretary of War, who would later go on to be President of the Confederate States, Jefferson Davis, who said, let's use camels. And he had the idea to start the United States Army Camel Corps. And if you're interested sort of in camels or also natural history, down at the Smithsonian Natural History Museum, there in the camel section where there's the camel skeleton, that's actually the skeleton of, I believe, Frank, who was one of the camels who they imported when Jefferson Davis was Secretary of War. And there's a little write-up on him, but he was rather unruly, as camels tend to not be super friendly. It didn't work out, so the U.S. Army was still stuck with horses. Other idea that we had was the same thing that a lot of the citizens had wanted, was the motor car. And at this time, they sort of called them different things: motor car, automobile, motor, sometimes just a Dodge. It was called by its name. The term car would come out shortly after this. And the term truck at this time meant wagon. It wouldn't be until after this expedition that the term truck would refer to a car. And it may actually be this expedition that sort of caused that car. And I think it's sort of interesting that we see the first trucks will be Dodge. And now Dodge has sort of shed its truck into Ram. Some of the benefits of a motor car versus a horse. Average speed of a car, a lot faster. Horse can gallop faster, but not as long. A car can carry its own gasoline. Horse can't carry its own forage. The truck or the car can also carry food for the soldiers, as well as 4 or 6 soldiers, a lot more than a horse can. It's a lot easier to work on than a horse. You don't need a vet, you just need a good technician. Most of the soldiers had no idea how to work on the cars, so they brought in a lot of sort of grease monkeys, as you would, or soldiers from Chicago who had worked on cars. They also brought in one of the Chevrolet brothers, Louis Chevrolet, who was a stock car driver, who would go on to found the Chevrolet Motor Company. He would serve as a mechanic along this expedition. It's a lot easier to throw a gas can in the back of a truck than to throw a bag of feed on a horse. If you've ever ridden a horse and you've got a whole bunch of bags on him, he wouldn't be too bad. You can hold 4 troops. The horse, feed and fuel. This is actually one of our first cars right here, the Dodge. And right here I have a picture of Daisy, of the first car. And this would be the Dodge 1916 that General Pershing would privately purchase and use during the expedition. They would be incredibly useful. Daisy is currently at the Chrysler Museum in Michigan. And the cars would they'd have some problems, but they'd use them mostly for a supply convoy. It would look sort of like what they said of wagon trains crossing the prairie. These are all Dodge 1916 touring cars sort of crossing the plain. They found it was an excellent way. They were able to go faster than the Villistas. Here's another sort of convoy. Here's the Camp Columbus, which is where the raid had begun. And if we see along here are different trucks. U.S. Army had no trucks before this expedition begins. But they initially say, we'll have 6 after they played around with Pershings. At the end of it, they had over 2,000 trucks, 90% of which were shipped directly to France to fight in that sort of next big war. What was the mission outcome? Well, it was a failure to catch Vila, but it was success in its sort of looking forward. In the Cardenas raid, Lieutenant George Patton, this guy, later General Patton, and 4 staff cars would capture and kill Julio Cardenas, who was Vila's sort of top lieutenant. It's the first use of an armored transport or of a motor vehicle in combat anywhere, and it happened by accident. They were going to look for food at a ranch, and there's a guy running out, and he starts shooting at them. And of course, Patton shoots back with his pearl-handled, actually ivory-handled. He would not appreciate the pearl, but pearl-handled 6-shooter, and they end up shooting Julio Cardenas, who was Vila's second in command, completely accidentally. And when they realized, they said, wow, we can really catch these guys a lot faster. Oh, what were the lessons learned? A lot of the trucks were shipped directly to France. As soon as the U.S. pulled out, they went over to France and became the Liberty trucks. They became the same convoys. Not transporting food as much, mostly wounded soldiers. They'd also be used in World War II. And of course, recently, trucks have found a new use on the battlefield, specifically civilian trucks in Afghanistan. Other issues? Does the horse still have a place in modern warfare? In Afghanistan it does, with some of the impassable terrain. So does the civilian truck. No. Lessons learned from about 100 years ago, now they still really apply. We got the Jeep, we got really modern passenger cars, really hadn't taken off by 1916. After the Punitive expedition, was really that impetus to the Army and sort of civilians. Some of the soldiers came back and said, wow, that car was really great. I want one of my own. And that was sort of the thing that really got America sort of on the move. Thank you guys for listening. Thank you. Professor?
I don't know if you've looked at this at all. I like the idea of the mechanization at this time because a lot of cities at the turn of the century are also going through rapid industrialization and mechanization with streetcars and people learning to live with industrial futures. Amusement parks were a huge development to get people used to the mechanical element with the body. Do you think that some of the initial hesitation to move from horses to cars was still this kind of period of getting used to living in an industrialized society when we still had a very urban-rural split?
I think absolutely. I think a lot of the soldiers who would write, oh, I don't trust these newfangled pieces of machinery. They must have used that phrase at least 20 times in different diaries that I consulted. A lot of those were rural soldiers. Some of the people who were more common, the ones who really formed the center of the truck corps, the mechanics, they were urban. They'd come from, a lot of them came from Arlington, from Fort Myer. Some of them had been streetcar workers in Arlington's original trolley car, which actually ran up Lee Highway. And I have one of them who lived not far from where we are today, just over in the Cherrydale neighborhood, who was a mechanic. But I think a lot of that hesitation to initially adopt is they've never really seen anything like this. And especially for a farm boy, maybe he was just drafted just before or just joined the Army. He's never seen anything mechanized. The era of mechanized tractors wouldn't really start until then. The first Waterloo boy, which would become John Deere, would be 1918, sort of the ending of the war. And we wouldn't really see mass production of vehicles. The first Model T was 1909, which was slightly before this, but they didn't really become a household item until sort of after World War I. Sort of this is the time of, I don't know if I trust that death trap. I found several cartoons of bouncing along in a Dodge or something which is going to kill everyone. So interesting time of change.